Thanksgiving night. I walked into my daughter's house and found my place card gone, replaced by one word at the far end of the table. Guest. Kendra raised a glass, thanked everyone who built this legacy, and left my name out. Then she said it plain. You're not part of this family's future. The room fell quiet except for forks tapping plates. The sting was real, but years teach you to breathe. I looked at my empty wine glass and thought of Evelyn, my late wife, and the promises we made about dignity. I didn't argue. I waited, because in my inside coat pocket was a sealed letter Evelyn left me, authority to protect our estate when kindness turned cruel. I had already lined up counsel. I knew exactly when to open it. You want to know what happened when that letter reached the judge, and how the people who erased me were the ones written out? Stay with me to the end, and tell me the city you're watching from. The driveway felt longer than I remembered. The late November air carried the chill of Boston suburbs, dry leaves scraping across the pavement as I walked with my suitcase in one hand and my old wool coat folded over the other arm. Thanksgiving used to mean warmth, laughter, and Evelyn's voice rising above the chatter as she reminded us all to count our blessings. Now, stepping toward Kendra's front door, it felt more like approaching a courthouse where judgment was waiting. Inside, the living room buzzed with cousins, in-laws, and friends. I noticed coats piled on the rack where mine once hung as a symbol of the host. My daughter, Kendra, greeted me with a smile that didn't touch her eyes. Damon, her partner, stood just behind her, his silence sharper than any words. They ushered me in with polite efficiency, not affection. When I entered the dining room, my gaze traveled down the polished table and froze. My name card was gone. At the far end, away from the golden light of the centerpiece, sat a plain card marked only with one word. Guest. I paused, gripping the handle of my suitcase tighter than I meant to. For years this table had been my stage, the place where I carved the turkey, raised the first toast, reminded the family that gratitude was worth more than any fortune. Tonight, I was being placed in the shadows, stripped of my name, turned into a stranger in the very tradition I had built. Sliding into the chair felt like shrinking into a corner of my own story. The whispers reached me even from down the table, questions from relatives who couldn't understand why the patriarch sat like an outsider. Kendra lifted her wine glass and offered a toast, her smile sharper now. Damon's hand rested lightly on her arm as if steadying her. Lila, my granddaughter, caught my eye across the room. Her lips parted, perhaps to speak, but one glance from her mother silenced her. She lowered her gaze to her plate, shoulders tight with the weight of words unspoken. I tried to join in small talk, asking about school, work, even the weather. Each time, conversations around me dissolved into silence. My glass remained empty while others clinked together in cheerful rhythm. A waiter, hired, not family, passed me by as though I wasn't there. Bitterness rose slow and steady, not fiery, but like cold water seeping through stone. I could almost hear Evelyn's voice echoing in the back of my mind. Harland, remember, gratitude first, even when it hurts. She would have hated to see what her table had become. The evening dragged. Damon leaned toward Kendra more than once, whispering words I couldn't catch. Each time, their eyes flicked toward me, quick and sharp, like arrows loosed from a bow. The knot in my stomach tightened. This wasn't just a matter of a misplaced seat or a thoughtless card. There was calculation here, intent. Being labeled a guest wasn't a slight, it was a declaration. My role was no longer father, no longer host, no longer the head of anything. It was erasure. As plates cleared, I noticed something new by my setting. Tucked discreetly beside the edge of my dinner plate was a sealed envelope, thick enough to feel heavy with consequence. My initials, H.A., were scrawled across the front in bold ink. For a moment, the chatter around me faded into nothing. My fingers hovered, then pressed against the paper, feeling the weight of whatever message it carried. I had been seated as a guest, but the message at my plate told me I was about to be something far worse. The envelope rested between the fork and the knife, as if someone had carefully chosen that placement. My fingers traced the edges before slipping it open under the table. The card inside was plain, white, without my name, only the word guest printed in bold. My throat tightened. A tremor in my hand betrayed me, so I folded the card back, tucking it into my pocket before anyone could notice. Confusion pressed against the pain. Being reduced to a nameless guest at my own family's table was a wound meant to cut deep. The meal pressed on with the clatter of forks, chatter bouncing from one end of the table to the other. I tried to focus on the rhythm of voices, the smell of roasted turkey and cranberry sauce, the faint creak of chairs as people leaned into conversation. Yet the envelope's weight lingered in my pocket like a stone. I kept quiet, not wanting to give them the satisfaction of seeing me shaken. Then, without warning, Travis leaned back in his chair, phone in hand, and let out a laugh that carried across the table. "Grandpa doesn't even know how to use Zelle," he joked, tapping the screen. The younger cousins chuckled, and soon the whole table rippled with laughter, everyone except me and Lila. She looked at me quickly, sympathy written in her eyes, before dropping her gaze under Kendra's sharp glance. The laughter stretched on longer than the joke deserved, echoing like a verdict. Heat spread across my face. I forced a thin smile, though inside, humiliation twisted. For decades, the money I saved, the estate I built, the sacrifices I made, all meant to give this family stability. Now those same sacrifices had been reduced to a punchline, a joke about being irrelevant, outdated, unnecessary. The bitter taste in my mouth had nothing to do with the food. I lifted my glass of water, more to hide my expression than to drink. Across the table, Kendra tapped her spoon against her glass, the room quieting in anticipation. She rose with grace, Damon steady beside her, his hand resting lightly on the back of her chair. "To family," she began, her voice warm and rehearsed. "To everyone who built this legacy and carried us here." Everyone lifted their glasses, eyes shining, except mine. She hadn't said my name. My absence in her words was louder than the cheer that followed. Then came the slideshow projected onto the wall, images of holidays past, children opening gifts, Evelyn smiling over pies she had baked, cousins at graduations, Kendra and Damon at fundraisers. Photo after photo rolled on, yet not a single one of me. A hollow laugh almost slipped out, but I swallowed it down. Instead, I kept my face steady, forcing the muscles not to betray the burn inside. The absence was intentional. The toast and the slideshow weren't mistakes. They were signals, a rewriting of history, one where I was already erased. In that silence, Evelyn's memory returned to me, her last Thanksgiving. She had insisted I sit at the head of the table, her hand firm on my shoulder. "Harland," she had whispered, "you've carried us through everything. Don't you ever forget it." Now, even her memory was being bent to exclude me, and that betrayal weighed heavier than the stairs of the room. I glanced across the table. Damon leaned close to Kendra, whispering something that made her lips curl into a knowing smile. They didn't look at me outright, but I caught enough of their smirk to understand they were laying the foundation for something more than just humiliation. Fingers tightened around the stem of my glass. I considered raising it, speaking out, reclaiming the moment, but the words never came. Instead, I set the glass back down, untouched, steadying myself with resolve. If my name could vanish from their toast tonight, the thought landed heavy. I knew it could vanish from the will tomorrow. The clinking of glasses faded, leaving only the low hum of voices and the scrape of silverware. The sting of being left out of the toast lingered like a bruise on the skin. Faces around the table shone with laughter and belonging, while an emptiness pressed into my chest. A memory slipped through the noise. Evelyn's voice, gentle but firm, insisting I take the head seat at our last Thanksgiving together. "You've earned it, Harland," she had said, her hand resting over mine. She believed respect was not optional. It was woven into the fabric of family. Tonight, that fabric had been torn. My eyes drifted to Kendra, her back straight as though she commanded the entire room. When she spoke, her words carried an authority that I once held but had long since been stripped from me. "Mom told me, before she passed, that it was her last wish for me to carry the family's legacy, she said, her voice smooth as polished glass. The table fell quiet for just a moment, then filled with murmurs of sympathy and nods of approval. Her lie landed like a slap. Evelyn had never said that. Her true last words had been spoken softly in our bedroom, a promise she wanted me to keep, that no matter what happened, I would protect the family and ensure her grandchildren grew up knowing gratitude. Yet here sat my own daughter, twisting those words to cut me out of the very legacy Evelyn had entrusted me with. The laugh lines around Damon's mouth deepened as he leaned closer to Kendra, giving her hand a reassuring squeeze. He didn't need to speak. His silence was its own endorsement. Watching him bask in my daughter's claim, I felt the anger rise, heavy and hot. Every sacrifice I had made, working long nights, missing opportunities, holding on to what Evelyn and I built, was being rewritten, stolen by the very people I loved most. Dinner plates were cleared, and the group began drifting into the living room. I followed, slower than the rest, my hand tightening around the back of a chair as though it might hold me steady. Against the far wall, a drape was pulled down, revealing a fresh arrangement of family photos. I stepped closer, scanning the images. Decades of memories stared back, weddings, birthdays, the children as babies, Evelyn smiling in the garden, and yet I was nowhere to be found. The air left my lungs. It wasn't oversight, it wasn't forgetfulness. I had been deliberately erased, my presence scrubbed from our history as though I had never belonged. One photograph after another confirmed it. Evelyn's smile was there, but not with me beside her. Kendra at her high school graduation, Damon's hand resting proudly on her shoulder, not mine. Even the grandchildren's first birthdays had been framed without the man who had paid for their cakes, bought the cameras, kept the lights on. A murmur of approval rippled through the guests at the display, while I stood, frozen in silence. Betrayal cut sharper than any knife. I realized in that moment that this was no accident. It was a campaign, carefully laid out to remove me not only from the table, but from memory, from the legacy that Evelyn and I had built together. Inside, the grief hardened into something colder. They thought they could erase me quietly, like an old photograph tossed into the trash, but I would not vanish so easily. I had seen too much, survived too much. I would not allow my story to be rewritten while I still had breath in my lungs. Across the room, Damon caught my eye. He raised his wine glass with a smirk that told me he knew exactly what I had just discovered. It wasn't just about seating arrangements or missing names. It was about the estate, the signature that still tied every thread of this family's wealth together. If my face could be erased from their walls, I thought, steadying my breath. I knew my signature would be next. The smirk on Damon's face lingered in my mind like a shadow that refused to lift. His glass tilted lazily in his hand as if he were already celebrating something at my expense. Around us, the air in the dining room turned heavy. Conversation didn't just stop, it evaporated, leaving behind a silence so thick I could hear my own pulse. I sat motionless, waiting for the next blow. Instinct whispered that something larger was coming, that tonight's humiliations had only been preludes. The chandelier above buzzed faintly, its light reflecting off polished silverware. The room looked as fine as ever, but beneath the gleam was a trap. Kendra broke the silence with a voice sharp enough to cut the air. "Let's be honest tonight," she said, standing and raising her glass, but her eyes were fixed squarely on me. "You're here only because it's Thanksgiving tradition, but you are no longer part of this family's legacy." Her words struck harder than a slap. I felt dozens of eyes flick toward me, then dart away as if burned by the sight. A ripple of gasps ran through the room. Someone at the far end whispered, "Did she just say?" Before trailing off into embarrassed quiet, I kept my face still, jaw set. It was the oldest weapon I had left, silence. A silence that didn't beg, didn't explain, didn't stoop to her level. My heart hammered, but I made it bow to my will. I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me unravel. The moment stretched so long it became unbearable. Then, as if some invisible signal passed around the table, the guests lowered their heads and returned to eating, Forks scraped against plates, knives clicked against china, the sounds echoing louder than they should have. No one looked at me, not a friend, not a neighbor. Even the old family friends who once toasted Evelyn and me pretended their green beans demanded full attention. The sound of utensils was all that remained, metallic, eerie, complicit. That was the music of my disowning. I drew in a long breath and cleared my throat. The scrape of a knife froze halfway down a plate. Slowly, deliberately, I spoke. "Be careful what you erase, Kendra." My voice carried low but steady. "Erase me, and you erase the truth of how you got here." A few heads lifted. A cousin shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The silence wavered under my words, as though I had cracked its shell. But across the table, Damon leaned back, smirk widening, enjoying the show as if it had all been staged for his amusement. Kendra's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing. For a moment, I almost thought I'd cut through her armor. Then Damon moved. Smooth, calculated, he slid a folded paper into her hand under the table, the gesture small but impossible for me to miss. My chest tightened. If her words had disowned me, his paper would bury me. Damon's hand slid the folded paper beneath the table as if it were contraband. Kendra caught it effortlessly, like they had rehearsed this moment. She placed it beside the cranberry sauce and the half-carved turkey, her fingers lingering on the edge as though it were sharper than any knife on the table. The room still hummed with the sting of her words from earlier. Every guest seemed to be waiting for what came next, and that scrap of paper sat there, humming louder than any voice. My eyes locked on it, not moving, but the weight of dread pooled heavy in my chest. Conversation sputtered. Forks clinked against porcelain. I forced myself to breathe slowly, watching Kendra's smile spread like a crack in fine china. Damon leaned back in his chair, the very picture of calm arrogance. Then came his move. Damon cleared his throat, as though the table were a courtroom and he, the presiding judge. "We've all agreed it's time to be transparent," he began, his voice oily smooth. "For everyone's peace of mind, some documents need to be reviewed." The words hit harder than any slap. He picked up the folded paper, smoothed it across the tablecloth, and slid it toward me. The guests leaned in, aunts, cousins, even neighbors who had no business at this table. Their eyes sharpened like they'd been waiting for this spectacle. Kendra spoke next, her tone full of false concern. "Dad, this isn't meant to hurt you. It's meant to protect you. Managing the estate, the assets. It's overwhelming. We think it's best if someone steps in." Gasps and murmurs rose around the table. I stared at the documents without touching them. The bold heading stared back. Petition for evaluation of competence. My heart thudded, but not from weakness, no, from fury. The audacity of it, to question the very mind that built every brick of this family's wealth, every opportunity they had ever enjoyed. I left the papers where they lay. My voice cut through the whispers, low and steady. "I built this with my mind, not with your signatures, not with your schemes. You eat because I worked. You sit in this house because I planned. And now you dare tell me I can't be trusted to count my own steps?" The room went cold. A cousin coughed nervously. A neighbor looked down into her lap. Damon smirked, savoring every bead of discomfort. He wanted me to crumble. He expected trembling hands, a stammer, maybe even tears. Instead, I gave him steel. But Damon wasn't done. He leaned forward, his tone soft, but every syllable sharpened like a blade. "Harland, if you refuse, there are legal avenues. Courts, judges, papers stronger than your voice." The threat landed heavy. A few guests shifted in their chairs, clearly uncomfortable. Lila's eyes darted toward me, wide with worry, but her lips stayed sealed. The silence was complicit, binding everyone at the table into Damon's corner. I swallowed hard, tasting not turkey or wine, but betrayal, the kind that sears deeper than any hunger. With deliberate calm, I placed my palm on the papers, slid them back across the table toward Damon, and withdrew my hand. My eyes never left his. "If you want me gone so badly, I said evenly. You'll have to pry the pen from my dead hand. The room froze. Forks hung in midair. No one breathed. And in that stillness, I saw Damon's smirk falter for the briefest second, just long enough to tell me he hadn't expected resistance. The papers still lay untouched in front of me, though Damon's hand had pushed them as close as the edge of my plate. I nudged them back without a glance, and the silence that followed hung like frost on the air. Kendra lifted her wine glass with a smile so tight it looked painful, her knuckles pale against the stem. Damon's jaw flexed, eyes fixed on me like a hawk circling prey. Murmurs ran through the guests, rising and falling in waves too faint to catch words, but heavy enough to remind me that every eye at that table had witnessed my refusal. No clink of silverware, no chatter about pie or football, only a quiet anticipation, as though the room was waiting for someone to draw blood. The weight of their stares pressed on me, but beneath the discomfort grew something steadier. I had been tested before, in boardrooms and courtrooms, in unions and banks. This was family, but the tactics felt the same. Corner the old man. Force him to blink. Damon finally broke the silence. He leaned back, voice low and measured, as if the words themselves were rehearsed. If you won't cooperate tonight, Harland, then you leave us no choice. We'll file a petition. Guardianship. The court will decide whether you're fit to handle $92 million. The words carried a cold certainty, as though he were announcing a weather forecast instead of stripping a man of his dignity. A hush fell heavier than before. His calm tone carried more menace than if he'd shouted. Guardianship? Someone whispered from down the table. The word slid through me like a knife. Damon's lips curved just slightly, as though he'd been waiting to savor the sound. He didn't stop there. For your own protection, he added smoothly, his glance flicking toward the guests. We've all noticed the lapses, misplaced names, forgotten details. This is not about greed. It's about safety. Every syllable was a lie, but spoken with the kind of confidence that made people nod before they realized they'd been led. My throat burned with indignation. I steadied myself, remembering decades of contracts and negotiations. Men like Damon always assumed calm meant weakness. They never understood that it was restraint, that the strike came later. My hand settled on the table, fingers curled around the rim of my glass, but I did not raise it. Instead, I met Damon's stare, let the silence stretch, and then spoke clearly. If you believe a judge will rubber stamp your greed, you've chosen the wrong courtroom. The words landed with a weight of their own. A few guests shifted in their seats, glancing at one another. Damon smirked, feigning amusement, but the twitch in his brow betrayed irritation. From my left, a folded slip of paper brushed my fingers. I glanced down. Sylvia Dornan, a longtime family friend and one of the sharper legal minds in the city, had slid me a note beneath the tablecloth. I unfolded it carefully. Call me Monday. A small flame of reassurance flickered. They weren't all blind. Still, the table strained under the fracture. One of my brothers-in-law, who'd said little all evening, cleared his throat. This is Thanksgiving, he muttered, just loud enough to cut through the silence. Not a deposition. The remark broke something open. Several guests nodded in agreement, murmurs spreading like cracks in glass. But Kendra shot back, her voice sharp enough to slice through the dissent. If you think protecting him is cruelty, then you don't understand what family responsibility means. The guests recoiled, more uneasy now. For the first time, I saw hesitation on their faces, not just toward me, but toward her. Damon leaned forward, his smile now thin, brittle. He set his glass down and placed both elbows on the table, closing the distance between us. His voice dropped so low I felt it more than I heard it. By Christmas, he said, you won't own a dime. Our eyes locked. His stare tried to drill through me, but it met a wall that had been forged across 75 years of storms. My breathing slowed, my body steadied. I let the words hang, then allowed the faintest trace of a smile to rise. They mistook my silence for surrender. The thought rang in my chest. Soon, they'd learn it was the sharpest blade I carried. The echo of Damon's words still lingered long after the Thanksgiving table had cleared. By Christmas, you won't own a dime. They had been meant to rattle me, but instead, they planted something steadier inside. a reminder that I had weathered storms before, and that silence could sometimes be sharper than shouting. A few days later, Kendra showed up at my door, her politeness brittle as the frost outside. She kissed the air near my cheek, eyes scanning my living room like she was already measuring it for new curtains. Her smile didn't reach her eyes, and her voice carried a tone reserved for patients in hospital beds. "Dad, you should really consider slowing down. People worry when you try to handle too much." I heard the unspoken accusation. I let it sit between us, heavy, while she helped herself to tea I hadn't offered. The smear campaign began almost casually, like gossip tossed over backyard fences. At church the following Sunday, I caught the first whispers. An old neighbor patted my hand, leaning in as though confiding, "Don't let it bother you. Harland, memory slips happen to everyone your age." The words stung, not because of what she said, but because I hadn't forgotten a thing. By the next week, the rumors had grown teeth. A cousin asked gently if I'd really been signing random checks. Another wondered if I was mixing up dates. Kendra's voice was behind it all, shaping the narrative, making me sound like a man already half gone. The shame burned hotter than anger. It wasn't just family doubting, it was the community I'd spent decades building, shaking hands, coaching Little League, serving on committees. They were being fed a story where I was no longer the steady hand, but a fading shadow. Then came Damon's proof. It was a Sunday afternoon, and family filled my nephew's house. Football murmuring from the TV. Laughter in the kitchen. Damon strolled in late, papers tucked under his arm. He waited until the room had quieted, his timing perfect. "Uncle Harland," he said, voice smooth as a salesman's pitch, "you might want to explain these." He laid out documents across the coffee table, signatures, transfers, my name at the bottom of pages I'd never seen. The cousins leaned in. Uncles frowned. Pages fluttered as if the very air conspired to spread them wider. Kendra folded her arms, watching like a prosecutor waiting for a confession. I bent over the papers, scanning them, noting dates that didn't align, addresses slightly off. For a moment, my instinct screamed to shout, to tear them apart. Instead, I sat back in silence, letting the room stew in its own discomfort. Silence was armor now. I refused to let their trap bait me into rage. Isolation deepened with the weeks. Marlon Keating, a family friend I'd known since my 20s, stopped by during one gathering. He rested a heavy hand on my shoulder, eyes full of pity that cut worse than anger. "Harland," he said gently, "maybe it's time to think about assisted living. Nobody wants to see you slip." The words landed like stones. The room around us hummed with unspoken agreement. Kendra's lips curved into a satisfied line. Damon sipped his drink, victorious without needing to gloat. That moment was sharp, unforgettable. Not only was I being painted as incompetent, but the verdict was public, sealed by silence from those who should have defended me. Despair clawed at me, but clarity shone through it. This wasn't clumsy concern, it was a plan. They weren't just rewriting my role, they were erasing me entirely. But then, something shifted. As I was preparing to leave that evening, coat in hand, Joanna Creel, an old friend of Evelyn's, brushed past and slipped a small, folded note into my palm. Her fingers lingered just a second, her eyes urging me to read later. At home, I opened it under the lamplight. The handwriting was hurried but firm. "I saw something you need to know. For the first time since this nightmare began, someone besides me had witnessed the lies, and that changed everything." Walking into the community hall, the December chill clung to my coat. The place had been dressed with garlands and lights, but no warmth touched the air. Every chair was already filled. Faces, some I'd known for decades, turned in unison. Kendra came toward me with a smile polished like glass. "Dad," she said, loud enough for all to hear, "thank you for making it. We weren't sure you'd come." The weight of eyes pressed in, expectation heavy, the kind that waits for a man to stumble. Every step toward the table felt like a walk into a carefully built snare. Damon rose slowly, a stack of papers in his hand. His tone carried the authority of a prosecutor, not a son-in-law. "We thought it best to clear the air," he said, sliding the papers across the table toward me. Here are the agreements you signed, giving Kendra partial control. We're simply following through. Murmurs ran like a current through the hall. My fingers brushed the edge of the documents. The signatures bore my name, but the strokes were too neat, too consistent, not mine. Forged. Rage bit hard in my chest, but I kept it caged. Silence, I reminded myself, could cut deeper than shouting. Kendra's voice softened, playing to the crowd. It's for his benefit. Dad has done so much, but it's time he rests. She placed a hand over Damon's papers like a benediction. Guests leaned closer, some whispering pity, others doubt. My place in the family story was being rewritten before their eyes. Marlon Keating, who once called me his mentor, leaned forward. Harland, he said with the tone reserved for a man past his prime, there's no shame in stepping down. Retire gracefully. Let the next generation take over. A few heads nodded. The trap was complete. Social pressure dressed as concern. They wanted me to agree so they could seal my erasure with applause. The scrape of chairs, the low hum of voices, all of it blurred together like a courtroom already ruling against me. I drew a breath, steady, waiting. Then a voice cut through, unexpected and clear. Joanna Creel stood near the back, her hands folded tight. That's enough, she said, eyes locked on Damon. I saw you with those papers last week. You were rehearsing your story, making sure the ink looked fresh. Don't act like these came from him. The hall gasped. A cousin covered her mouth. Someone muttered, Is that true? Damon's jaw clenched, but his face betrayed a crack, a flash of panic before the mask returned. For the first time in weeks, the weight on my chest eased. Meeting Joanna's eyes, a thin thread of hope pulled taut between us. I wasn't the only one who had seen the lies. Damon's hand slammed against the table, silverware rattling. His voice dropped, sharp as broken glass. If you won't step aside, old man, we'll force you in court. My reply came steady, low, carrying every ounce of defiance I had left. Then I'll meet you there, with truth as my witness. The hall froze, and in that silence, the door opened. Sylvia Dornan stepped in, a leather folder tucked beneath her arm, gaze unflinching as it swept the room. The battle they had hoped to win with whispers was about to face the light of a courtroom. The house was silent when I stepped inside that night, though my mind was anything but. Damon's threat from the hall echoed as if the words were carved into the walls, but so did Joanna's courage. Her quiet defiance had shifted something. For the first time in weeks, it wasn't just me against them. And when Sylvia walked into that hall with her folder in hand, steady as a stone, it reminded me that not everyone had swallowed Kendra's narrative. Relief was there, small and fragile, but it was real. I sank into my old chair, the same one Evelyn used to scold me for never reupholstering, and let the weight of the day roll through me. Tired. Yes, but the tiredness carried resolve instead of despair. Over the next few days, the phone never seemed to rest. Some relatives, their voices trembling with guilt, called to apologize for doubting me. I should have spoken up. One cousin muttered, shame thick in his words. Others weren't so kind. A niece told me bluntly that Kendra had warned them I was slipping, and they couldn't take the risk of being tied up in a mess. Family ties frayed with each ring of the phone. Kendra, ever calculating, doubled down. She whispered to anyone who'd listen that Joanna was unstable, that Damon's paperwork had been taken out of context. But I could feel the cracks spreading. Their perfect facade of control wasn't as seamless as they believed. Sylvia stopped by one evening, spreading files across my kitchen table the way Evelyn used to spread recipes. Her eyes were sharp behind her glasses as she tapped each document. Damon won't wait, she warned. Expect him to file something. Guardianship. Incompetence. Anything he thinks will stick. We'll need every record, every bank statement, every contract you've signed in the last decade, and we'll need people to stand for you. Her tone was calm, but the message was heavy. It wasn't just a dinner table skirmish anymore. It was war, written in the language of law and money. Anxiety coiled in my stomach, but with it came a strange steadiness. I had spent a lifetime building, defending, and protecting. This was no different, except now the enemy was my own blood. That night, I sat alone in the den, surrounded by old photographs Evelyn insisted we never take down. Her smile glowed from the frames, a reminder of what we had built. The estate wasn't numbers in an account, it was the last thread tying me to her. Each brick, each acre, each decision we made together had been born of sacrifice. That was why I couldn't walk away, why I refused to let them erase me. Losing the money would hurt, yes. But losing her memory to their lies, that was unbearable. The grief surged fresh, but it steeled me. This wasn't about pride anymore. It was about protecting what was ours. The phone shattered the quiet near midnight. My first instinct was dread, but when I answered, the voice on the other end wasn't Kendra's or Damon's. It was a clerk from probate court. His words rushed, whispered. "Mr. Avery, I thought you should know. They've filed for emergency guardianship. Hearing set for early January." My hand tightened around the receiver. So it had begun. Damon and Kendra weren't waiting for me to break. They were dragging me headfirst into the fight of my life. The courthouse steps gleamed with a thin sheet of ice that January morning. Breath clouded in front of my face as I gripped the rail, the cold biting like the nerves rising in my chest. Boston winters had a way of stripping things down to the bone, and today felt no different. Evelyn would have told me to wear the heavier scarf, but she wasn't here. All I had was her memory, and the weight of knowing this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about her legacy, our family's sacrifices, and whether I still had a place in the story I helped build. Inside, the probate court buzzed with the low hum of clerks and lawyers shuffling papers. Damon was already there, seated with his attorney, slick, expensive, the kind of man who probably billed more in an hour than most families made in a month. Damon leaned back, self-satisfied, while Kendra hovered just behind him, whispering in his ear like a shadow. Her eyes flicked toward me, cold, rehearsed, the way she used to look when she was a teenager demanding the car keys. Only now the stakes were millions, not curfews. Sylvia slid into the seat beside me, her briefcase neat and orderly. She touched my arm lightly. "We're ready," she said. Her calm steadied me, though the tremor in my hands betrayed more than I wanted anyone to see. I nodded, drawing in the scent of polished wood and stale coffee. The courtroom was no dining room, but it carried the same kind of judgmental silence I'd felt on Thanksgiving night. The judge entered, robe flowing, voice curt. The bailiff called us to order. Damon's lawyer rose smoothly, announcing that the matter at hand concerned my declining capacity to manage the estate, my estate. His words were clinical, but every syllable landed like a slap. He pointed to fabricated bank records, carefully arranged to suggest I'd been careless, forgetting dates, signing things twice. Sylvia countered without hesitation, producing affidavits stacked in neat rows. Among them, Joanna's written statement glimmered like a lifeline, her account of seeing Damon with the supposed evidence before it was ever presented. The judge raised an eyebrow, not dismissive, but cautious. "We'll need more," she said. That was the game. They'd try to bury me in paper, hoping I'd drown before the truth surfaced. Anger curled hot in my gut, but beneath it something steadier stirred. They wanted the image of a man crumbling under age. Instead, I would show them a man who had built, endured, and still carried the strength Evelyn had trusted for decades. When my name was called, I rose. The courtroom seemed to shrink as I walked to the stand, every step echoing the years behind me. I raised my right hand, swore to tell the truth. Sitting there, under the gaze of strangers and the smug smile of my own son-in-law, I felt the weight of silence pressing in. Then Damon leaned forward, smirk broadening, and slid a thick folder across the polished table toward his attorney. The judge gestured. "Proceed with your evidence." The folder snapped open, pages spilling out like a trap long prepared, and in that instant, I knew. Damon hadn't come to prove I was unfit. He'd come to erase me entirely. The courtroom felt colder that morning than the January air outside. Damon's attorney slid the folder across the polished wood, opening it with a deliberate snap. Inside lay the petition for guardianship, thick with accusations, signed pages, and Kendra's neat handwriting at the bottom. My daughter's name glared at me more cruelly than any lawyer's stamp ever could. Kendra adjusted her jacket and rose. Her voice was syrupy, practiced, the kind she'd once used to charm donors at charity events. My father has been increasingly forgetful. He's misplaced large sums, signed checks without realizing it, and spoken to people who aren't there. We love him, but his judgment isn't safe anymore. Each word was a blade. I kept my eyes fixed forward, jaw set, while the judge scribbled notes. Kendra glanced toward me once, just long enough for our eyes to meet. There had been a time when that look held pride. Now, it carried only calculation. The attorney pressed forward, waving bank slips and vague anecdotes. We have reason to believe Mr. Avery's $92 million estate is at risk. For his safety and his family's guardianship is necessary. Gasps fluttered in the gallery. My chest tightened, but I didn't let the hurt show. They weren't just trying to seize what I had built. They were rewriting who I was. Sylvia rose calmly, adjusting her glasses. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Your Honor, we challenge these claims. Here are notarized records from the past 6 months. Contracts Mr. Avery personally negotiated. Signatures verified. Decisions executed with clarity. She laid each page with precision, like a surgeon exposing false tissue. Additionally, here is an affidavit from Joanna Creel, a community member with no financial interest, confirming Mr. Avery's active role in estate matters. The judge leaned forward. Damon's attorney shifted uncomfortably. A hum of whispers spread through the pews. I felt the faintest release of pressure in my chest, like the first breath after surfacing from deep water. Then my name was called. Slowly. I stood and took the witness chair. The oath felt heavier than ever before. My name is Harland Avery, I began, steadying my voice. I am old. I've earned these years, but I am not erased. Every brick in the house I live in, every dollar in the estate they circle like vultures. I know where it came from, because I built it with my wife, with Evelyn. The mention of her name cracked something inside me, but I let the pain carry strength. She believed in gratitude. She believed in honesty. To say I'm incapable is not just to insult me, it's to dishonor the life we lived and the sacrifices we made. I saw faces shift in the gallery, an uncle looking down, a cousin biting her lip. Even some who had turned cold wavered. Damon's attorney leapt up, sensing momentum slipping. Mr. Avery, can you tell us the date of your granddaughter's last recital? The exact sum of your quarterly dividend from September? A trap. Damon smirked from his seat, but I leaned forward. December 3rd, and $94,612 after expenses. The smirk faltered. Murmurs rose louder now, doubt weaving through their confidence. Kendra fidgeted, tucking her hair behind her ear. Damon leaned in close, whispering something sharp. The judge rapped her gavel once. I have serious concerns about the petition's integrity. I am postponing ruling until further review. Her eyes lingered on Damon longer than they did on me. This matter is far from settled. Relief washed through me, thin but real. I rose and turned toward the aisle. As I passed Damon and Kendra, his jaw was tight, her eyes darting. They had expected a burial today. Instead, they'd been forced to watch me stand, outside. The night air cut against my face. Sylvia walked beside me, her folder tucked under her arm, her steps firm. They'll come harder now, she said. I nodded, pulling my coat tighter. The morning came cold and gray. Boston streets still slick with a dusting of snow that hadn't melted overnight. The courthouse loomed heavy against the winter sky, but the weight on my chest was heavier still. Lila had come by before dawn, quiet as ever, setting coffee on the table without a word. Her presence steadied the room more than caffeine ever could. Evelyn's locket hung warm against my chest, a reminder of what I carried into battle. Today wasn't about money. It wasn't about numbers on paper or titles on deeds. It was about whether I still counted as a man in my own bloodline, whether I existed at all in the story my daughter and Damon were trying to rewrite. By the time I walked into the courtroom, the benches were already filled. Damon sat forward in his chair, crisp suit pressed, his jaw locked like a man rehearsing victory. Kendra perched behind him, face painted with that polished politeness she wore whenever she lied. Sylvia brushed my sleeve lightly, a signal. Don't let them see you rattled. The judge's voice broke through the hush. The petition for guardianship is denied. Gasps rustled through the gallery like wind through bare trees. The judge wasn't finished. Furthermore, the integrity of this petition is in question. Forgery and coercion are referred for investigation. Kendra's face blanched, lips parted in shock. Damon didn't flinch, but the stiffening in his shoulders gave him away. My victory wasn't in shouting. It was in sitting still while the ground shifted under them. Then Sylvia rose, calm, precise. She set a laptop on the evidence stand. Joanna's video filled the screen, her voice shaky but clear. The footage showed Kendra at Thanksgiving, her tone sharp. "He's not my father tonight." Damon's whisper followed, coaching her to push the incompetence angle. Gasps again, louder this time, followed by whispers no one could contain. Sylvia didn't stop there. She slid documents forward, Damon's shell company routing payments, signatures copied with clumsy strokes, invoices tied to non-existent consulting. The judge's eyes narrowed, and then the final blow. From my own lockbox, a sealed codicil Evelyn had left behind, her signature strong as the day she'd put pen to paper. It established a protective trust to trigger if coercion ever darkened our family. Her foresight became my shield, even from the grave. The gavel struck. My control over the estate remained intact. Investigations would follow. I didn't smile. Dignity is quieter than triumph. In a conference room afterward, Sylvia closed the door, leaving only Kendra, Damon, Lila, and me inside. My daughter's face held fury under its veneer, Damon's a sheen of sweat. "You disowned me over dinner," I said, my voice level. "I won't beg for belonging at my own table." I opened a small dessert box I had kept hidden since that night. Inside was an envelope Evelyn had marked years ago, open when cruelty wears a kind face. Her handwriting, firm and familiar, blessed me with the authority to remove any heir who shamed the family for gain. With Sylvia's guidance, I signed new instructions. Kendra's inheritance shifted into a trust for education and health care for the grandchildren only. Damon was cut out entirely, pending criminal review. I looked at Kendra, not with rage, but with the clarity Evelyn would have wanted. "This is love with boundaries. Cross them, and you lose the right to claim it." By afternoon, cameras crowded the courthouse steps. Damon brushed past, muttering about misunderstandings. Reporters swarmed, but Sylvia handled them with a simple statement. The law had spoken. Nothing more. Kendra's board called for her resignation that very evening. Marlon Keating turned his back in the neighborhood, and Damon's smile faltered for good. I walked Lila to a cab, thanked her for reminding me, in her quiet way, that humanity mattered more than headlines. She squeezed my hand once before disappearing into the cold. As dusk settled, I sat on a bench at the public garden. Bare elms arching overhead, the air smelled faintly of snow. I dialed Travis. His voice cracked with guilt before he spoke more clearly, asking if he might start fresh. I told him of a scholarship in Evelyn's name, free from family hands, for him and the grandchildren to earn their place honestly. "I'll meet you halfway," I said. "The rest is your work." That night, in the stillness of my townhouse, I placed Evelyn's codicil back in the lockbox and set the silver locket beside her photograph. Their schemes had tried to write me out with paper. I had answered with proof, with boundaries, and with a blessing they'd have to earn.